Welcome, everyone. This is actually the last of our weekly webinars this year. And suffice to say, we're going to go out with a bit of a bang, because this is going to build on some work that you've heard us talk about previously. As a matter of fact, we did a webinar on this exact same topic with a little bit different focus with EDF back in June earlier this year. Fantastic information set that was shared. Really got to hear about how certain operators are taking steps to mitigate their own flaring on in their own properties. EDF has continued to move forward with looking at this issue and has engaged with Rystad Energy to conduct a study on flaring in the Permian Basin. And we're going to hear a little bit about that today, and then get into a discussion about what the implications of that study are. I'm fortunate today to be joined by Mike McCormick. He's a project manager at Rystad. He will actually be delivering some remarks on that study. And then we'll hear from Colin Layden, who is the Director of Regulatory and Legislative Affairs at the Environmental Defense Fund. And then we'll hear from Mark Agerton, who is one of our former PhD students, now an assistant professor at UC Davis, and remains affiliated with the Baker Institute as a non-resident scholar. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion. If you have questions, please submit them through the Q&A box. I will be reading through those and compiling them into lists of questions that we can address as we move through the conversation. So with that, Mike, I'm going to pass it over to you. The floor is yours.
All right, thanks a lot, Ken. And yeah, thanks to the Baker Institute for putting this on. Also, thanks to Colin and the rest of the team at the EDF for being our partners throughout this process. So I just wanted to, quick remark on the project that we worked on. The report that you're about to see is a very short summary of a longer piece of work, which will be published on after this session online, so that you'll be able to access more backup material here. In terms of what we were asked to evaluate, and what we looked at was the developments and the potential drivers of flaring in the Permian Basin in Texas, and to forecast that going forward under a simple flat price scenario, and to evaluate what different policy scenarios may do to that forecast. So that's sort of the main topics that we'll cover here. Should spur some interesting discussions afterwards. I'll now touch just on the high points here. So, after doing this work, there's really 4 main interesting findings that we came up with, and I'll touch on them here and then go into more details. But first and foremost, just looking at publicly available data disclosed by the Railroad Commission on wellhead flaring, we assessed this across several different dimensions to see if there was some clear drivers as to where the flaring was taking place, by whom in terms of operator, and when. I think we did determine that flaring is very much a concentrated issue among a relatively small subset of production that flares the most. More than half of production has over the last 5 years had relatively low flaring intensity, and this sets the stage for talking about how we can address that upper worst performing quartile, if you will. Secondly, we did a lot of analysis trying to understand what the actual drivers are, and if we could, in some way, identify them using only the publicly available data, but also talking with different stakeholders in the industry, testing our hypothesis against them. And we came up with an approach to disaggregate flaring, which we'll go into. And what we found is the 2 major causes of flaring in the past few years have been, of course, what we call events, which are sort of intermittent increases in flaring at the well, lease, or county level that might be caused by outages or pressure on the system causing causing temporary increases. But second, most importantly, and perhaps most addressable, is that a quarter of all flaring was happening as a result of temporary increased flaring shortly after completion of new wells. So this is a reflection on sort of mistiming and miscommunication between upstream and midstream, and perhaps economic decisions taken by some operators to flare in the early life of wells. There's several different reasons that could also cause this. But these two components are, I guess, the most important to address going forward by the industry in order to achieve a more sustainable level of flaring. Thirdly, in our forecasting, we assessed at a relatively modest commodity price and modest activity level that flaring on an absolute level could again surpass 2019 levels by 2025, and that flaring intensity could reach about 3.5% again, which is roughly the level that we saw from 2014 to 2017 when the basin was really taking off. And then finally, we took an assessment of how we might reduce the flaring and the costs that order of magnitude might be incurred by the industry. And we think that getting the basin below 2% flaring intensity is very doable with a fairly limited investment towards reducing these flared volumes by the industry. So with that, I'll touch on the highlights of each of these as we move forward. Just briefly here, restating what I had already said, is that basically almost 2/3 of gas production, if you refer to the chart on the left, contributes only 7% of flared volume. So essentially the way to interpret this is a distribution of flaring and production as a function of flaring intensity. And we see that, more than half and almost 2/3 of gas production flares cumulatively over a period of several years, not just a point in time, of less than 2%. And more than 50% is actually less than 1%. So there's a lot of better performing areas in the basin that haven't had really bad issues, or high flaring for an extended period of time, notwithstanding one-off events which happen across the basin. And then to the other side of the chart, you also have a sort of a tail end where you have a small relative amount of production contribution, about 10% of gas production, which, by the way, also corresponds to only about 14% of liquids production, but contributes 57% of all flared volumes over the last 5 years. So this is the challenge that we face. This is where we as an industry and as all the stakeholders in the industry need to look into how to address bringing sort of the top end of this curve more in line with the bottom end. And that's not to say that there aren't also improvements that can be made within sort of that green area, because there are and there have been through, year over year, there's been significant improvement in each year. So with that in mind, I guess I can talk now a bit about how we work to kind of identify different sources and drivers of flaring. On the next slide, this is a common question that we face in the industry is how do we sort of define different types of flaring? What constitutes routine, non-routine? There's a lot of different terminology. We at Rystad Energy, we don't attempt necessarily to align perfectly with outside sources. We sort of came up with a framework that suited our needs and fit the public data that we were working with to the best of our ability. So what you see from the top here is that if you recall the green box from the previous slide, which is sort of the top performing areas in the basin, we use their average flaring profile as a benchmark, and we apply that to the rest of the basin. And you can see that exemplified in the well curve to the right, where the average well is the black line and the green is the top performing wells. We use that to identify how much flaring there would be in the basin were all wells to perform at that level or better. The second part is event-driven flaring. It's often referred to also as intermittent flaring. This is mainly about temporary increases in flaring intensity beyond sort of what can be considered a noisy threshold that we think are most attributable to sort of large and small events occurring either in the midstream or at the lease or well level. And then lastly, we have routine flaring, which is essentially the difference between the two. So any flaring beyond our top performance benchmark that we can't attribute to an event or a one-off occurrence, we consider that to be routine. And you'll see going forward, we talk a lot about temporary routine, which is, as I mentioned, a lot of the flaring that occurs on new wells versus long-term routine, which occurs on wells that flare at a higher level for several months beyond sort of the initial production of a well. So bear this in mind as we move on. I will, talk to these sort of categories somewhat repeatedly. So this following slide basically describes the results that we get when we use these rules and this sort of methodology to disaggregate flaring. In this case, we're showing 2019 flaring. It's around 450 million cubic feet per day total. And what you see is that if we applied this top performing benchmark to every single well in the basin, new and old, we would actually flare at a level 93% below what the actual performance was, right? So this represents sort of the best achievable level given sort of the current best practice in the basin. So there's still improvement beyond that, but that is certainly a target or a goal that we could think about. Secondly, and largely, the largest is event-driven, and that's 56% of all flaring occurring in the basin is attributable to these one-off increases in flaring intensity on either the well or the lease level. So this is a little bit, I would say, colored by 2019 and 2018. They were truly sort of extraordinary years in terms of the number of outages and disruptions that occurred in several counties in both the Delaware and the Midland Basin. But this is still something that we think increased because we were approaching, sort of system capacity and had a lot of issues related to, gathering and pipes running at a high level. Thirdly, we have routine flaring, which makes up the remainder, 37%. And the largest portion of that is really the temporary routine, which we think, is driven a lot by operator choices to just flare early in well life. You have also the long-term routine. This mainly happens on small leases with few wells or maybe low liquids production and gas production where there may not be as strong of an incentive economically to commercialize the gas. It could also be for, a few gas quality reasons and things like that. We've heard this happens in some cases. Moving on to the next slide, we can look at this over time. And as I mentioned, this event-driven flaring really took off, for lack of a better word, in 2018 and 2019 because of a number of outages in different counties. And we see these sort of systemic increases across an entire basin or across an entire gathering system that were driven by some sort of midstream outage, which caused these large increases in event-driven flaring. We also saw a pretty remarkable increase in the routine flaring, largely driven by new wells being completed, brought online, in some cases at the same time as there were outages in the area, but also just more and more reasons economically that people were choosing to flare gas routinely. So we use this as our baseline sort of history. And then if I move further one more, we see how our forecast looks. Bear in mind, this is a flat price forecast at 45 WTI $3 Henry Hub from 2020 onwards. And you can see for reference, we've had a truly extraordinary year, as we all know, especially, in this industry, where we have had a lot of volatility on activity, on production, and also on flaring. So the actuals there, we think are more or less difficult to forecast based off of. And also we use this sort of flat price as a benchmark to gauge our alternative scenarios against. What you see is that we actually return to a level of 450 or so million cubic feet per day by 2025, which is, a challenge. So we have to look at how we can sort of tackle this issue. And then that takes me to the policy portion of this, where we're going to, evaluate two different alternative policies against our baseline, which we just showed. So the baseline that was shown was actually pre the new rules implemented by the Railroad Commission. We, of course, had the new Rule 32 exception data sheet changes implemented in November. That is the subject of policy 2 here, where we will evaluate what impact that quote unquote soft policy will have on the industry's flaring levels going forward, and see where and how operators can reduce their flaring in that scenario. Then policy 2, as a further test, we evaluate the effect of gas capture requirements or gas capture targets, which, as you can see, are implemented gradually from 2021 until 2024, from 90 to 98%, and then flat at 98% from 2024. So those are the two policies you'll see repeated in the next few slides. And from there, we'll evaluate, how much this would reduce flaring, at what cost, and at what benefit to the different stakeholders in the industry. So this slide takes away our results of these different scenarios. So there's a lot here, but basically starting from the left, we assess the reduced in absolute terms flaring level of policy 1 and policy 2 compared with the baseline. So under the Railroad Commission's policy, which is now our reality, frankly, we believe that the increased transparency of more more information being provided by operators, and the requirement for more justification for why and how you're flaring and for how long, will have impacts on both the amount of permits granted and also the length of some permits. Not a huge impact, but it's mainly driven by changes in operator behavior, movement to not flare volumes that they would have normally. So that results in a reduction of about 20% from our baseline in 2025, which is about half of policy 2, which results in a capture. The capture requirements would essentially mandate that anyone above 2% flaring intensity in 2025 reduce flaring below that level. This results in a flaring level in absolute terms of around 42% below the baseline. So it's a fairly significant reduction in flaring. And we see on the right side that this results in an actual, we get below the 2% flaring intensity mark for the basin as a whole under this second policy, which is still slightly above the US average. In 2019 was around 1.6%, but it gets us closer to where we want to be. But there's still a lot of room beyond, this type of gas capture target for further reductions. But now that sort of brings me to the discussion of what are the costs and benefits of this. So on this slide, we talk about the outlook of flaring on the left, disaggregated into different groupings in terms of their potential cost to abate. So there's a portion of routine and a portion of the event-driven that you see that we assess to have zero or potentially negative costs to abate, depending on sort of commodity price. And then you have the remainder of routine, event-driven, and then the remainder that's sort of our benchmark that would incur abatement costs to reduce. And for routine flaring, we think a lot of the avoidable flaring that has no cost is from these temporary flaring events happening on the early life of the well. On the event-driven side, it's more difficult, but there's still a portion of this we believe that can be reduced just by improving sort of turnaround time, response time to events, and improves operational efficiencies that can effectively mitigate the effect of some of these events, which were in some cases lasting months that could potentially have been resolved earlier. So those are the zero cost components. And then we eventually work our way into sort of parts of the flared volume stack that actually require some cost to mitigate. And on the right side here, you see how we work our way down this stack in policy 1 and in policy 2. So in policy 1, in the data sheet scenario, we assume that zero cost flaring reductions will be undertaken. About 50% of the potential total will actually happen by 2025. That's what really drives the 20% reduction in overall flaring. So there's a good potential here to improve, operators' performance without a strict sort of capture target, but it doesn't necessarily get us down to a level sub 2% flaring intensity, which isn't necessarily an end state anyway. With the second scenario, we work through almost all of the zero cost routine flaring, effectively all, and almost all of the event-driven zero cost flaring. And then we start to incur a very small portion around this 98% gas capture target. We'll start to incur some abatement costs to avoid this flaring. And as you get further down the stack, of course, you'll have a bit more abatement costs. But in general, this type of target doesn't eat very far through the sort of the free volumes, if you will, that can be avoided. On the next page, we talk briefly about the different value potential for each of these scenarios. So under a policy 1 type of scenario, we can actually achieve a net value, wellhead value creation to operators, royalty holders, and the government potentially of about $200 million USD per year from 2025 after sort of the full reductions take place. And under policy 2, we get significantly higher value creation, even in light of the fact that we're incurring abatement costs. So the line you see here for policy 2, the roughly 390 million in 2025, that's net of $50 million in abatement costs in 2025. So this is a take on how much potential there would be in terms of value creation to the industry if we were to reduce flaring through the second policy, gas capture. Finally, I guess before I sort of turn it back to the group, I just want to address the year that we've had. I think we see a pretty interesting development in 2020. We saw a lot of improvements in late 2019 and early 2020 from the spikes that we saw in late 19. But then we had another spike in wellhead flaring in March, just before sort of the price war and COVID ultimately, sort of took the floor out from activity in the basin. And I think there's a lot of different voices in the industry that and in the broader community that would argue that this might be a cyclical downturn, and it could potentially be a structural improvement that either was facilitated by the downturn or was going to happen regardless of the downturn. We aren't necessarily concluding on that. I think the jury's still out very much. As more data ticks in 2020, in 21, we'll probably have a better sense. But there's a lot of different good arguments in favor of either way. And I guess we should try and study this more throughout this year and sort of understand what this means for the outlook for flaring going forward. So with that, Ken, I guess I can turn it back to the group. Thank you so much for your time and look forward to the discussion now.
Fantastic. Thanks, Mike. I know I've got several questions for you, and there's more than a handful that have poured in. But before we get to those, because I think both Colin and Mark will have some comments with regard to the questions that have come in. Let's turn it over to Colin now. Colin, if you want to take the stage and make a few remarks, that'd be great, and then we'll get to you, Mark.
Thanks, Ken, and thank you, Mike. I will try and be real brief because I do know there's going to be a lot of questions. So I just wanted to say a few things from EDF's perspective on the report and maybe a few things on its implications as well. I think first, the report makes clear that routine flaring is fixable. It's the low-hanging fruit for flaring reduction. It appears to be relatively cost-effective for operators. It's really the cheapest type of flaring reduction available, and a lot of money is being wasted. Very low rates of flaring are achievable. We saw the top-performing leases have very low flaring intensities, sometimes around 0.3, 0.4%. If all leases were at that level, as Mike said, we'd eliminate 90% of all flaring. And then another thing is that flaring intensity on the routine side appears to be in the early months of a well's production. It peaks in the second month and then decreases after that. This has policy implications. It speaks to, from EDF's perspective, how the Railroad Commission's proposal to reduce those initial administrative permits from 180 days to 90 days, while certainly will have some impact, misses a bit of the mark because all that flaring occurs, or a large portion of the flaring occurs in the first few months of the well. So in our opinion, to tackle routine flaring, a plan must be in place for the gas before the well comes into production. And then real quick on the gas capture scenarios that we asked Rystad to analyze. So that's a familiar policy tool for reducing flaring. North Dakota implemented them in 2014 with some success. New Mexico has included a gradual 98% gas capture requirement into their recent flaring rule and flaring and venting reduction proposal. It's more as a backstop to complement some tighter permitting that's in that proposal as well, which we think is really necessary to get at the root. So, it can offer operators a degree of flexibility while establishing enforceable concrete targets. Of course, they need to be enforced, but they're not the only policy solutions that's needed if we really want to finish off routine flaring and then also get it at some of the event-driven flaring. As the report points out, gas capture rules gets pretty close to eliminating routine flaring, but not entirely. And to fully eliminate it, we'd need some additional policy. So Railroad Commission needs to tighten up the interpretation of their existing rules. Some people and some operators I've talked to have said, the rules as they are good. We just need to change the way we interpret them. And I think that there's some truth to that. We need to get back to the historical interpretation of physical waste as being the priority as opposed to economic waste, where right now the full economics of the well aren't taken into consideration. What we've seen in the last 15 years has been an interpretation around economic waste as the primary lens for when flaring exemptions are granted. We don't believe this is the historical intent of the waste prevention rule. So I think that's a place that needs to change. And then we need to put an end to these long-term flaring extensions. On the same day that the commission voted on these changes to the Rule 32 data sheet, they granted 60 of these long-term flaring permits. So these are permits that go beyond the initial 180 days to flare. So that's an area to focus on as well. And then lastly, I just want to say something on the event-driven flaring and the midstream. So eliminating routine flaring does help drive down event-driven flaring, but it's not gonna solve it completely. So I think we need to start really focusing attention on midstream solutions. I don't think we have all the answers on that yet, but it does seem like it's a fixable problem. I think there's, just throw out a few ideas for discussion, but, with these midstream failures and interruptions, are there common equipment things that are failing, or is there a way to identify those common failures, and then maybe we could build redundancies like we do on downstream facilities for some of those components that are likely to fail and cause interruptions. There's probably a role for the Railroad Commission, and I think I actually heard the new Commissioner Wright, Commissioner-elect Wright, talk about the need for better communication between the midstream and operators. That's definitely something that Railroad Commission could play a role in. Maybe there is a way to create a little bit more visibility and transparency between the two sectors so that decisions can be made more quickly with a little bit more foresight into capacity. So I'm going to leave it there and hand it over to Mark or back to Ken. And I look forward to the questions. I've been trying to track them as they've come in, and they look like they're really interesting.
Thanks, Colin. Mark, I do want to actually turn it to you now because you've been doing a lot of work on this issue, as well as, thinking about venting, right, from unlit flares. And maybe if you could talk a little bit about the work you're doing and connect to the conversation so far and offer some of your own insights.
Yeah, well, first of all, Ken, thanks so much for the invitation. Colin and Mike, it's great to be here with you all. This is a really impressive piece of analysis that Rystad's done. I know the data pretty well and how hard they are to sort through. So my hat's off to Rystad for putting together such a thorough piece here. The first point I wanted to make that I thought was especially salient was that came through in the report is that Rystad doesn't see flaring going away. And it's not like, the new pipelines being constructed are going to eliminate all of the flaring. So I think that this remains a policy issue and an important one. And in fact, we've seen actually over the past couple of years in Midland, while new wells get hooked up sooner, they're also flaring a higher share of their gas during the first few years of their life. So the next point I wanted to raise was why is this really a policy issue? So why do we actually need to do something about this? I think one reason would be the state's not collecting severance taxes on these, so there's a revenue issue at the state level. And then some royalty owners, may not be collecting royalties on the gas that's flared, depending on how their contracts are written. In my mind, the important salient policy issues here are local air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. So currently we're interested, one of the questions we're interested in is how many local air pollutants flaring creates. West Texas is fairly sparsely populated, but if you live near a flare, you might be breathing things that are harmful to human health. And then, EDF I know has done a lot of work looking at the efficiency of flaring in the Permian Basin. So even though the EPA's target sort of flaring greenhouse gas emissions assumes a 2% kind of loss of gas, I know that EDF is you've measured flares out in the Permian and find that we're actually venting about 7% of the gas that's flared. So if we look at that in terms of a greenhouse gas emissions and what would be the social cost of carbon there, we're looking at around $1 in MCF incremental damages from flaring versus capturing the gas and sending it through the pipeline system to market. It's a lot better than venting. Venting is $19 to $26 a ton. Or $19 to $26 per MCF in terms of damages cost. So flaring is much better than venting, but I think there are certainly environmental damages that we can see from flaring, and that's really the economic argument for why a regulator would need to step in. In terms of the solutions, I think, Colin, you talked a lot about event-driven flaring. I think we see that as well, that more than 50% of flaring in the Permian is happening on leases where that lease is also selling gas in the same month. So it's not like it's a choice, flare or don't flare at the monthly level. It's flare some or flare none, really. And I think we'd like to see more leases get to that flare none versus flare some. So it's the problem here isn't that we're just not hooking up the well at all to gathering infrastructure. It's much more about we are hooked up to gathering, but we're also flaring some in the same month. And that's that event-driven flaring that the report highlighted. A few other policy issues that we've been thinking about and we're really interested in. One is a discrepancy between what satellite data reports and what the regulator sees in terms of flared volumes. And so we're interested in what misreporting is going on, and is that something that is representative of a large share of flaring. Another thing that we are strongly focused on is a different policy mechanism. So we've talked about the reporting requirements at the permitting level. We've talked about a portfolio standard. What would a tax on flaring look like? Right now, the state of Texas doesn't tax flared volumes with the severance tax. Those are exempt. And so certainly restoring the severance tax onto flared volumes. And then if you wanted to tax flared gas to incentivize operators to capture it, you look at just the sort of methane emissions on average, you might arrive at around a $1 tax. The last piece I wanted to cover here in looking at the policy issues is thinking about the market structure on the midstream side. So reducing flaring really requires that you have the midstream infrastructure in place. And so we've talked a lot about how it's important to have cooperation between upstream and midstream. As we have more stringent regulations come on, that can change the negotiation potentially between midstream operators and upstream producers. So if there's a very large penalty for flaring gas, that could potentially hand midstream operators additional power in those negotiations. We've seen something like this happen in the Exco versus Williams case, which came before the Railroad Commission, I think a year or two ago. And we also see, if you look at the comptroller kind of wellhead value of the gas being produced, there's an enormous dispersion in how much companies are valuing the gas at the well within the Permian Basin. So that means there's enormous potentially either differences in gas composition or differences in the cost to get that gas to market. And so that's one of the things that we are thinking about, is when you start to layer in these policy mechanisms that work really well in a purely competitive market, you may have these additional distortions coming in the midstream. And so that's something that we're trying to think through and understand how much pricing power is really there and how that would affect policy.
Great, thanks, Mark. So there are a ton of questions that have come through, and I'm going to start floating them to all three of you. But there's a couple of things that I want to just draw everyone's attention to. In the announcement for this webinar, we actually note as a motivation for flare reduction, what happened with the contract that Engie had signed for delivery into France, where the French government actually turned it back, noting concerns related to the environmental footprint of production in the United States. And this is actually a really important point that's not just a European point. In fact, we are leading a pretty broad discussion on the future of natural gas in sub-Saharan Africa right now. And we had a workshop this morning. It was a closed workshop, but one of the themes that was brought up by various regulators and investment managers in the region was as natural gas use grows in that region, in sub-Saharan Africa, they want to avoid the pitfalls that are being noted with regard to production in other places around the world. And Texas actually explicitly came up. So this is an issue that has gathered global attention. It's not just something that is relevant at a local level? And that begs a really important question. And I think everybody sort of touched on it a little bit, but I want to throw this to y'all because it ultimately is relevant in terms of how new regulations are ultimately passed and enforced. Mike, you noted that a vast majority of the flaring that's observed is occurring in a particular quartile, right? One of the lowest performing quartiles in the data that y'all examined with regard to producers. And that's interesting because if that ultimately exerts a pressure, sort of an ESG type pressure, on the ability for marketers of gas, even the best performers, to sell their gas abroad, then in effect what you have is the lowest quartile imposing a cost on the better performers. And we all know that at some point that results in movement just in terms of lobbying or argument within regulatory bodies about how to address that. And absent an explicit price, maybe it's a new regulation or a shift in regulation. And I just wonder, because I think all of you are at different levels connected with those types of conversations, what are you hearing on that front? Because we've certainly seen that some of the better performers and larger operators have made commitments to eliminate routine flaring. Others have, started to move in that direction, noting these issues. But if basin-wide they're not addressed sufficiently, it doesn't really help them at the end of the day. And so one has to wonder what might be coming down the pipe. So I'd love to hear y'all's thoughts on that. And then I'll come back with another question.
Sure. Yeah, I can speak to my experience, I guess, speaking with, with the different players out there in the basin, meaning operators. I think you hit the nail on the head. Is the largest players are absolutely, this is top of mind, and this is something that almost everyone is talking about in boardrooms nowadays. So this is a very topical issue. It's a black eye for some that are trying to position themselves for sort of the energy transition and their place in the next 50, 100 years in the world. This is a challenge, especially when in the last 4 to 5 years, a lot of companies set their strategy based on the Permian Basin, and then this has been a really big point of issues. But I think what we don't necessarily see or hear, and this is just the nature of the industry, is we don't hear a lot of movement from the smaller cohort of really small private, even to medium-sized private operators who just don't have the public agenda that the larger players do. So it could ultimately be that the larger players are pushing them even harder than what we might think, just to try and improve this for the basin as a whole, because it's definitely impacting them.
So Ken, I hear we are coming into a legislative session. It's hard to predict what happens around this issue there, but I do know that there is interest from various legislators around trying to put a price on flared gas. I do think that there's some, I would say, shock that we're not taxing the gas as it is, and that also it could further be used as a mechanism to reduce it. I do think it'll be a topic of discussion at the legislature. Very difficult to know how far that debate goes in passing anything, but I certainly think that it will be talked about at the legislature. And then I think your point about where this is headed from the market perspective is on point. Europe is looking at methane standards around the gas that they import. They're the largest market for LNG. I think that, most folks think that the future for domestic U.S. gas is probably as an export product. It won't be long before other countries like in Asia are also contemplating similar type of standards. So, no one likes to take business advice from an environmentalist, but it does seem like like the markets are headed in a place where these issues need to get addressed.
I just wanted to chime in. I've read a bit and been a part of a few discussions about trying to track what is the carbon or methane intensity of kind of natural gas production and midstream and distribution. And I think one of the real challenges here is just coming up with the idea of a green gas market where we could get some sort of certification that our gas is particularly environmentally friendly. I think the big challenge there is how do you certify that, and working through how much of the potential fugitive methane emissions along that whole value chain is the operator responsible for when they get certified, and then how do you detect these methane potentially leaks? We know there's a long right tail of those, but how do you certify that this gas was produced and didn't leak out of the distribution system? I think certainly there's been a lot of movement on remote sensing, and there's a lot of potential there. And so I think, for having a green gas market that really worked would be a great thing, and could allow the market to kind of have a undifferentiated kind of gas that might have higher leak rates, and then people could pay a premium for a green gas that they knew that was had less leaks associated with it.
That's actually a point that's already finding a home in the market for LNG. You're seeing companies move in that direction. So it's interesting to connect that back to the Permian for domestic supplies even. But Mark, I want to ask you specifically a question related to satellite measurement, because I know you've been doing some work with some folks at the Payne Institute at the School of Mines on this issue, and they have a pretty good program where they're tracking it. And we even had a webinar earlier this year with Kairos, who's looking at tracking methane emissions. And all this really highlights how much more transparent this space has become, right? You can't really run and hide anymore from this issue. And as it becomes more and more prevalent, one wonders, how the data is going to be used and ultimately responded to. But could you just real briefly talk a little bit about the data that you've been able to access and see and what it's really telling us?
Yeah, so I think that the kind of challenge with satellite data, it's public information. It comes from these government satellites, and it's a way to verify regulatory data and kind of look and see at an area level how much meth flaring is going on and how much methane is being produced. I think the real challenge with using satellite data in regulation or in certification for a green gas market comes from it because it's very difficult to tie satellite measurements to particular pieces of infrastructure or to a particular well. We do a great job at detecting it at a wide area, but it's much more difficult to take satellite data and say, oh, operator A flared here. And so that means we have what's called a non-point source pollution problem, that looks a lot more like, say, fertilizer runoff in the Midwest, where you can sort of regulate an area, but it's very hard to go specifically to the actor that caused that particular emissions and incentivize them to reduce their emissions. So there's a whole lot of promise in terms of being able to monitor these things much more accurately and understand much better how much methane we're emitting. But more work needs to be done both on the kind of technology side and then on how do you actually get these measurements down to the infrastructure level. I know that some programs might be able to do overflights and get things at a much higher resolution. And so I know there are some different cooperatives, Bluefield and GSGSat are working with various companies and coalitions to kind of come up with a more detailed monitoring that could potentially be used for certification. But at this point, it's difficult to use the satellite data to go to a particular point source and either regulate it or know that a leak, happened at this lat and long.
Well, it's interesting you made this an issue of technology, because you know how I feel about that. If it boils down to technology, eventually we're going to figure it out. So I think the space is rapidly evolving and will continue to do so. But this sort of brings me to a question I want to direct specifically to both Colin and Mike. It's really solutions oriented, and it has to do with potential technology solutions to address event-driven flaring, and maybe even expand own use or local use of gas that is currently being flared. And one of our questioners, one of our audience members asked a question related to this specifically with regard to event-driven flaring, which it appears to be occurring with some degree of regularity, which begs the question, how predictable is it? And what types of technologies could be applied on site to mitigate that? And at the end of the day, if there's a value proposition in that, why isn't it happening?
You want to go first, Mike?
Sure, I'll give a few words to that. As far as technology trends that have happened and have caused issues, really, I think a lot of this boils down to scale and right sizing sort of your gathering system and your processing system for the size of your operation. So we've had a lot of issues with legacy old existing acreage or existing practices where you had basically gas processing for one or two wells or one pad or two pads of wells rather than having it centralized. And this has caused a lot of problems, and a lot of this infrastructure is outdated, unreliable, not being maintained for some smaller players. And what we're seeing with through consolidation and through just improvements in planning, we definitely see that a lot of operators are moving to a more centralized approach, which improves the reliability of the system as a whole, and ultimately will hopefully lessen the frequency of these types of profiles where you seem to have events happening every month or every 90 days on one lease.
And I'll just add to that on the technology side. I've certainly been on the phone and seen many presentations on some of these on-site solutions. There's companies out there that have movable skeds that use the flared gas to power a small little server farm. Just recently saw one that used excess gas on site to evaporate produced water. So as a sort of a waste management on the produced water side. And then there's ideas about generating electricity, feeding into the grid, or using the flared gas to power on-site equipment. And I think all of these are potential, successful technologies. I think you're right, Ken, there's an issue around scalability. I'm not an economist, but in my mind, I think what has to happen first is that the cost of flaring has to increase, whether it's, cost, as you said before, you can increase the cost, whether it's through regulation or a tax or some other fee or something like that. But right now it's just, it's cheaper to flare. And then, I do think, though, that you're right that on the event side, maybe this is an area where on-site solutions will play a bigger role. We've seen pressure on the investment side, on the capital side to reduce flaring, and that's why we're seeing these big companies. So maybe we'll see more and more of these on-site solutions take off and play a more significant role in flaring reduction in the future.
Excellent. Thank you both. Mike, I do want to come back to something I had asked, and I'm going to augment it a little bit because I think this might be really in your wheelhouse. It has to do with the regularity of event-driven flaring and how predictable it is. But beyond that, there is some data, and maybe you can shine some light on this, that I've seen that indicate gas-oil ratios in oil production facilities tend to be going up as we move out into lower tier acreage. And this actually raises another point that maybe if you could address, because one of our listeners did ask this question. when you talk about gas flaring, it really is in an oil-directed venture. You're not going to flare gas from a gas well because you wouldn't drill the well if that was what you were doing. But that said, if gas oil ratios are rising, if we do indeed see that, has that factored into your analysis first? And then secondly, if you could comment a little bit on event-driven flaring and how regular it is, and whether or not you see something that could be substantially done about that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I'll answer the second one first on event-driven. There's certainly a very big difference between what we kind of call small events versus large events, both locally, in terms of geographic location, as well as temporally how long the event occurs. I think these large events are inherently unpredictable. They're in some cases they're significant damage to equipment that simply can't really be predicted. That's the nature of it. And the same goes with some very small events at the wellhead or HSE events. I think a lot of that, very small hours to days, would still be considered a routine event under our framework. But the smaller events, it goes back to what I was saying about centralized infrastructure versus sort of more piecemeal development. I think there's a lot of smaller events which you can see happening on different operators' acreages and positions that are happening with a lot of regularity. So they're certainly aware that this is happening, but it still proves to be cheaper to just resolve it each time that it occurs than to permanently fix it, because you're talking about a producing lease with a lot of older production that's more stable. And in terms of the gas oil ratios, I think we definitely see movement into a bit more gassy parts of the basin. I think this has primarily is to the benefit of reducing flaring, because you're exposed much more in terms of your investment decision becomes much more contingent on commercializing the gas, because you're getting much less liquids out of the wells. As to if this is impacting our analysis, we do sort of phase in development of non-core parts of the Permian. That's sort of baked into our activity forecast. So you should see sort of a shift to more gassy wells, assuming those are drilled sort of within the window of 2022 to 2025. So it is a part of our analysis, but it's also, I think, somewhat beneficial depending on if you start to move beyond a threshold where the gas is really a decision driver to drill or not drill the well.
Thank you. Colin, I actually have a question for you, and I realize we're almost up against it on time, but there were a few questions that came through with regard to the role of state regulation versus federal regulation. And you and I both know this can get very complicated, and we could probably spend another half hour talking about just this. But if you could perhaps just give it a couple of minutes and really expand on, why state regulators are so important in this space.
Yeah. So on the issue specifically flaring, so on methane emissions, we have seen the federal government take a role on that. And I think we're going to see the Biden administration re-engage on methane emissions at the federal level, and that'll help in Texas. But on flaring specifically, other than maybe equipment performance, the EPA really delegates that authority on permitting flaring to the state level. So that's why if you really want to see improvements on flaring at the state level, I mean in a basin, it has to happen at the state level. And we're seeing that in Colorado. We're seeing that in New Mexico. And in fact, I think, we're going to be faced with a situation where operators operating the same lease on one side of the border are subject to different flaring rules than they are on the other side of the border. So that'll be interesting, but hopefully it'll drive a little bit more change here in Texas.
Great, thanks. Just being conscious of time, Mark, I just want to tell you that there's actually quite a few, and this is for the benefit of those who have reached out, who want to talk specifically to you about some work that they've been doing and measurement. So we will make sure that those of you who requested to speak with Mark directly, that your contact information is shared with him, and y'all will be able to connect. That's not a problem. On that note, we are up against it on time. Once again, fantastic discussion. This is the flaring issue, unfortunately, is the gift that keeps on giving. Hopefully we'll get to a point where that's not the case. And certainly, I think this type of analysis Mike presented today is a good step in that direction, because if you can highlight where there's a real value proposition, it becomes difficult to ignore it. And I think certainly on the ESG front, on the measurement and data collection front, the space is evolving very rapidly. And before long, it's going to be difficult to mask these issues in any way. So once again, thank you, Colin. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mike, for joining us. To everybody out there, happy holidays, happy New Year. We'll be back at it again in January. Until then, stay safe and stay healthy.